Planetfall, Abby McArthur-Self. This story is a work of fiction. For a summary and all content warnings, please see the last page of the document, or skip to 8 minutes 3 seconds. Copyright 2022-2024, Abby McArthur-Self. All rights reserved. This story is freely available to read, but may not be printed, distributed, or otherwise reproduced without written permission, except in the case of short quotations for reviews and other non-commercial purposes under fair use. This writing is not available for AI training purposes. Cover design and illustrations by Abby McArthur-Self, printed in Astro Space and Salma Pro. Planetfall, Abby McArthur-Self. This short story was originally published without illustration in Travel and Adventure, the 2022 anthology of the New Lennox Writers Group. Minor edits for correctness and clarity have been made for this version. Dedicated to Lachlan McArthur-Self for the idea. Herbstflut mission, Day 000, Miriam's craft. Kalea looked up, eyes trying to trace the familiar stars and constellations through the smoggy sky, but the smoke was too thick. Though faint glimmers occasionally shone through, the stars were buried. Perhaps that was one thing she could look forward to from abandoning her home. She would finally see the stars again. Not only that, she would be among them, like the fairy tales of old, the fantasies her grandparents had dreamed of when humanity first started sending machines into space. She wished it hadn't taken the total ruin of the planet to get them there. But still, every cloud, even a pollution-made acid rain cloud, had its silver lining. She tried to think of it as a great adventure, the next step in the evolution of a species, but she knew what it really was, a failure. They'd failed to use their resources, and for all their technology, they'd failed to save their planet. They'd made the air more toxic with each passing year. Kalea was one of the first scheduled to be evacuated, and although she knew it was selfish, she was relieved. The planet wouldn't support life much longer. She was a scientist, an environmental limnologist. Her job had been prolonging the life of the planet's water supply, and she'd done her best. She'd given them an extra 10 years of drinking water, but it wasn't enough, and the rest of the planet didn't even have that long. So, she was being evacuated, because the government hoped she could stop this on their new planet. If she could prolong the life of a planet as broken as theirs, they'd said, imagine what she could do with a new one. They would be set for eternity, or at least until the sun burned out. As she boarded the shuttle, she looked at the cloud-covered sky one last time. It had all happened so fast. Couldn't she see the Little Dipper just there above the horizon, not 20 years ago? Herbstflut mission, Day 110, Miriam's craft. After half a year in the emptiness of space, the ship landed in pure daylight. Colder than Kalea was used to, but brighter than she'd seen in years. The sky was open and blue, fluffy, white, clean clouds sparse across the expanse overhead. She wanted to laugh out loud. They'd made it. They were standing on the soil of a new world, surrounded by scraggly brown and green plants reaching up through the clean air. And now, for the first time, it seemed real. Survival was possible. This was a genuine shot at life, not just a desperate last-ditch attempt to fight a fate they'd created. Of course, it could always be both, but things were looking up. She was looking up. The plan was working, and for once, everything was going right. Herbstflut mission, Day 124, the New World. The universe was a heartless bitch. Or maybe karma was far more real than Kalea wanted to believe. Either way, something out there had a sense of irony, and it was screwing them over. She really shouldn't have thought things were going well, because as soon as she did, they didn't. Her crew had been hoping to find a way to power their ship. The planet seemed to have plentiful resources, but none of their equipment was compatible. They lacked the supplies, or sometimes the know-how, to use those resources. There were entirely new species and entirely new minerals, and nothing was working the way it should. The ship had registered the air as breathable just minutes after they had landed, but they'd realized as soon as they reboarded that the ship wasn't cycling in new power like it had at home. Panic set in, voices clamoring over one another. The crew were specialists in different areas necessary to the survival of their species on a new world. Someone had the idea that they should each pick one essential task in their specialty, something they needed immediately, and something they couldn't perform without the ship, and make the most of the power they still had. Kaleo went to test the water. There was a pool about a half-day's walk away, and by the time she got back with the sample, another 12% of the power had been drained from the ship. Kaleo felt like she was holding her breath the entire time the ship tested the water, too frozen in to even will the outcome. Thank the unforgiving skies, it was drinkable. The others had done their best, investigating plant and animal species and trying to manufacture whatever tools they could think of that wouldn't require power. Most of them were crude, based off the crew's memories of historical drawings. Almost none of them were anything the crew members had actually used before. In the end, they'd been forced to abandon the ship and move farther into the savannah that they'd landed in, without a way to gather energy and charge anything. Their technology failed them just 2 weeks into their new lives. They were on their own. Herbstflut mission, day 267, Earth. Time passed, and, though they recorded it, it felt unreal. A year and 42 days after leaving home, Kaleo stood over her 5th morning fire on this new world. The earth itself seemed to spark under the dry brush they'd gathered, and the sunset painted the sky with blood. A tenth of their crew had fallen prey to wildlife that they were totally unprepared to deal with. They learned after the first time that dead bodies attracted animals. It was such a stupid thing not to have thought of, with their custom of vigils. They lost 2 more people that night. They started burning the bodies and burying the bones. Still, the rest of them had survived, and Kaleo was amazed they'd survived as long as they had. Their group, the first group, was primarily scientists. They were supposed to have their ship. Fighting bizarre and deadly creatures for survival was not really in their skill set. But they did it because they had to, and while 6 deaths felt like an incalculable cost, she felt naive not to have expected worse. She didn't know if the other groups would ever follow. Their ship had run out of power before the second check-in, but it didn't really matter. How could the others be any more prepared for this strange new world? Strange indeed, and yet it seemed more real now than her memories of home. How would they explain their world, days away through a black void they couldn't reach anymore, to their children? Assuming some of them lived long enough to have children. How long would it be, she wondered, before they forgot Venus entirely, before Earth was all they knew? Would it doom them to repeat the same mistakes? Summary. Kaleo is evacuated from a dying planet to shepherd water use on the new world. When their technology fails, she has to face what their lives will truly look like. Warnings. End of the world scenario, off-page deaths. About the author. Abby McArthur-Self is an avid nerd with an eye for the strange and slightly garish. They're available at amacarthurself.weebly.com.